We're now focusing in on our intervals, looking at the Locrian mode around this B note, which is on fret number 7 on the high or thin E string at the bottom of the guitar. Before we do that, let's do a quick intro as to why you might want to go through these kind of exercises, practicing your intervals, focusing a little bit more time this time on the idea that we have the Locrian mode. Why in the world would we want to be learning the Locrian mode? One of the reasons that I'm trying to piece together and possibly put another kind of course or training session for my own purposes as well as possibly yours is to try to look at basically this shape and be able to name this shape multiple different ways, because my theory is that to actually learn something, we want to be able to see it from different perspectives. In other words, one definition of do you understand something, in my understanding, the way I see it, is that you can see it from basically multiple angles. If you can see something from only one angle, then you know it from one perspective, but you don't really know it unless you can see it from multiple different angles. And when you look at something that's really simple, but then you really break it down into multiple different perspectives, you'll realize that you don't know it anywhere nearly as well as you would think. Like even the alphabet A to G, even if we take out the sharps and flats, I bet most people will have problems if they start at any point in the alphabet and start to count it backwards or forwards, or to say, how could you go from A and then you're going to a D? How many steps are you taking when you go from this point to that point? So we can't really, if we really break it down, we only know it one way: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and even then I have to sing the song. If I don't sing the song, it's all over. It's not happening, right? So what we want to, of course, be able to do is try to learn it from different angles. You see this happening in like a math class, for example, as well, where oftentimes what I tended to do a lot of times was to say, I know it from this perspective. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the problems, I'm going to convert it into this one perspective, which I know, and then I'm going to like solve it from that point. You can do that, but a lot of times that's a longer approach than if I was to be able to approach the problem from multiple different perspectives, as long as they follow the logical routine, which oftentimes they do. Similarly with the fretboard here, we've got the musical alphabet, but it's lined up on multiple different strings. So there's obviously basically an infinite amount of ways that you can kind of view basically the fretboard. It's going to be the general idea. So I want to get into thinking, okay, how can I label these notes in such a way that I can see them from each of the scales, major scale, minor scale, but also be able to play the other scales within it, even though I'm playing the same shape, the different modes, in other words. And I'd like to be able to then start and stop the scales from each point on the guitar, and I'd like to be able to define the intervals as from no matter what perspective I'm looking at. In other words, no matter what mode I'm looking at. And that becomes most clear because, say, if you're playing in the Locrian mode, then as I go to from the one of the Locrian to build a chord, which would be that diminished chord, if I was playing in Locrian, which a lot of people don't, but if you're playing in Locrian and then you go to another chord like the D chord, then you have to look at it, of course, from the perspective of the D here, right? So now I'm playing a D Dorian modal chord if I want to play all the notes in the same area. So I have to then build it from the perspective of the D. So therefore, to be able to do that as seamlessly as possible, I want to be able to get dexterous, be able to move as quickly as possible from one thing to the other in terms of my perspective of the fretboard. So let's get a quick idea of that before we dive into this. So remember, we're on the Locrian mode, which most people don't play in Locrian, but is still important because what most people do is they kind of drop the Locrian note out. So in this case, it's the B. You might just say, I'm not going to play a B chord. Why? Because I don't want to deal with a diminished chord, right? But it would be better if I can make some workarounds so that I can include the Locrian chord in one of my progressions and try to say, well, how can I do that and fit it in a way that works? And the three things we looked at last time was that you can play it as a leading chord back home. So if you're playing in the key of C, so if I scroll up to the key of C, then, so now you have the same notes, right? But then the 7 now is a Locrian modal chord. So when I get to this B and I want to build a chord on it, then I'm going to say, okay, well, I could build a Locrian modal chord. The problem with that is it has this diminished, this flat fifth in it. But that sounds okay if I'm leading home to like the C. So it kind of resolves that way, but it gives you that big tension. Now, of course, the problem is that you have that same Locrian when I'm playing like in the Dorian, all the same notes, but now I want to make the D the root. So what if I'm playing in Dorian and I get to the same B? It's not the 7 anymore. I get to this B. What am I going to do with it now? Because if I play something that's really tensiony, it's going to want to resolve to the C, which maybe you can do that even while you're playing in Dorian, but you're going to run into the danger of doing that you're trying to play in Dorian to make the D the center, and you just resolved to the C, so it's going to start to sound like the C is the center. So that becomes a problem, right? Because what I want to do is resolve something to the D when I go back home, at least. Now, you could have another focal point within the song or whatever, like a C at some point, but that'd be the general idea. So what am I going to do with that B note then? Well, I could maybe just convert it to a minor chord, or I could just drop the 5th, right, and just put a 3rd in it, so I could just add a 3rd but not add the 5th, something like this, and then go to D maybe. Or I can just construct it if I'm doing a pattern and I go up to that B. Then we said last time that we can construct a chord that maybe would just be a minor chord, right? Because if it was a minor chord and I went from the A, like here's an A minor shape and then a B minor shape, because those two are constructed the same, although one is not in the key of a D Dorian, it doesn't have a note. One of the notes is not in the key of D Dorian, the flat 5th, it should be back here. Versus, but because I played them in order, then it will kind of work, right? And then so I could even go and then to the D minor, or let's play it this way, same shape. You can kind of play with that, and then of course you can always do with the half step, right? So if I'm taking half steps to the B, then that could help me to play it within a minor. So if I was going back to this D minor, like this, playing it like this, and I went from, the B back, you could play in like half steps, basically trying to bring it back that way or something like that. But those are kind of your options to kind of break out of the B. Now, but what I'd like to be able to do now is to be thinking, okay, so usually I think of myself in the key of C, and that's going to be our Rosetta Stone that we compare everything to. Now, notice if I'm not trying to memorize the notes in the key of C. You can do that. That'd be cool to do. But what I'm trying to do is memorize the relative positions on the guitars, and the way I can basically build this shape is either I just learn the shape, possibly with the caged system, learning the 3-note chord, adding the 2 notes to get to a 5-note pentatonic, which fits on 4 to 5 frets because I have 4 to 5 fingers. That's how the guitar is structured. That's why we can cut it into 4 to 5 fret structures, basically. And then I can add the 2 other notes, getting a 7-note, which would be the scale, which I can then focus on any note within, which would be making the modes in a particular scale, right? So I can learn it that way. I can learn it by using the formula, which I think is possibly least common in the guitar, more common in piano, because you have multiple strings. The formula would be something like whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That would be the major formula. But that only works when I count it from the C. If I counted up the formula from like the 2nd note, it would be like I'm counting it from the Dorian, and instead of going whole to there, I would start on the next whole, half, right? Whole, half, whole, right? Or whole, I don't want to. But that's the general idea. I might do another kind of course on that one because I think that's the least used one. But I think it's relevant. And then we can, of course, construct by interval, which again, oftentimes we think about the C as the interval we construct from. On guitar, typically we don't build the whole shape by interval, although you can, and it is useful to do so. What we typically use the intervals for is to learn the shape of the interval and then build chords, particularly triad chords. So we try to build a triad chord by building the intervals. What I'd like to do beyond that is to be able to say, we'll look at each of these shapes. I want to learn basically the shapes on the guitar and be able to name the shapes by their absolute mode, meaning the start of each absolute mode. And the reason I can do that is to say, like, look at this box right here. What is in this box? It's going to be, this is the major right here. It's always the major. The same box is down here, right? The same box is here, except it got shifted up because this fault line shifted up. So that's actually the same box that's been shifted, right? And then, so then that's the major, that's the Locrian. This is the Lydian, and this is the Phrygian. It's always the same. In other words, I'd like to be able to memorize the starting point of each of these where I'm at, no matter which mode I'm playing in. So how could I do that? Because the reason we can't do that as easily is because we have no place to say, where's my reference point for measuring? Because it's going to change what I call this C. It's either a C, but then if I play in another key, it's going to be a different note, but it'll have the same shape. And I can't say that it's going to be the first. I can only say that if I'm in the C major. Because if I was in the Dorian, that C is, although it's the same C and the exact same shape, is now the 7th, right? But it's still the same C, right? So what I could do is I can name it based on the mode. I could say, well, this C, no matter what mode I'm in, no matter what relative position I have related to the C, will always be the start of the Ionian mode, which you can think of as a scale, but you can also think of it as a modal chord. So I don't care if I'm in the C major. When I get to the C, I would be playing a major modal chord of some kind, right? If I was on the Dorian and I get to that C, it would now be the relative position 7, but I would still be playing a C major modal chord. If I was on the Phrygian, here's the C, same exact shape, but now it's relative position 6 in relation to playing in the Phrygian. But I'd still, when I get to the C, I could still see it's exactly the same spot. It's actually in the same square. It's still the Ionian mode. I'd still be building an Ionian chord, right? So that's what I want to do is be able to look at each of these shapes and basically be able to put my mind on what kind of modal chord I'd be playing no matter what mode I'm kind of playing in. So I can learn kind of like these shapes, which again are going to be movable. They'll be exactly the same if I moved it up to go to a G major and all the related modes. Well, how can I do that? Well, a lot of times people have trouble memorizing the Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, and so on in order, in part because, what are they, Latin or Greek? You know, they don't sound like normal language to me as an English speaker. You know, maybe if I was Italian, maybe I'd understand. I'm trying to learn Spanish, but my Italian is basically bad Spanish, that then I try to talk bad Spanish with an Italian accent that probably sounds more like an East Coast. I don't know. So it doesn't sound, so it's hard to memorize. It's hard to memorize those, but you could number them. So what I would do is give them an absolute numbering system. So I'm going to say, and I'm going to base the numbering system on the major scale. Why? Not because the major scale is more important from a modal standpoint than any other, but from Western music standpoint, it is. It's like if I'm trying to measure the universe, physics, whatnot, I happen to be on planet Earth, right? You could say, well, from physics, it's just as easy to measure from the planet Mars and look at it from that perspective. Yeah, but I'm not on planet Mars, okay? I happen to be on planet Earth. So let's look at it from that perspective, unless you want to define something that you're going to tell me about looking at it from the perspective of planet Mars, right? We have to define the terms here. So, right, so we're going to say, generally, I'm going to name them on the major. and use those as an absolute numbering system. So if I say the Ionian is absolute modal chord or mode number 1, Dorian is mode number 2, the Phrygian is mode number 3, that lines up to the relative positions of the major scale. But then when I go to like the Dorian scale, if I look at that C, then now I'm going to say, well, where is the C in the Dorian scale? Or where is this note in the Dorian scale? Where's this position at the top right of the box with regards to the Dorian scale? Well, its relative position to the Dorian, number 7. It's relative position 7. But from the perspective of the modes, it's what I would call absolute mode number 1, which would be which is the Ionian mode, right? So that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to basically look at each of these notes and be able to say, okay, from each of the scales, I can look at the relative position per scale, but I'm also going to give it an absolute position in my mind, naming it the mode, and giving it an absolute numbering system based on the major scale to try to orientate. I said it right. Orient myself. I always say orientate. I don't know if that people tell me that's not right. I feel like it should be a word. I'm going to make it a word. We got to orientate ourselves. Okay? We have to orientate ourselves. All right. So in any case, so that means that's going to be basically, I think that'll help us to kind of to keep track of where we are at any particular point. So that means so now we're going to be comparing the Locrian, the major scale, to the Locrian mode, right? So let me put these two in place. If I go from this A to B, for example, what are the multiple different ways I'd like to be able to kind of get in my mind to think about this, these two intervals? If we're going from the C back to the, so if we go from the C back to the B, I'm kind of going in reverse if I think about it as behind right here. And there's another thing I just want to point out that I've been mulling over it's kind of a trip that maybe you haven't thought out too clearly like I hadn't, which is that when we look at the intervals, when we look at the formula, we say it's whole, half, whole, half on terms of the wholes and half steps, but we always kind of go forward, right? And when we look at the intervals, we're always kind of looking at the intervals going forward, like one way around the circle. So in other words, if I'm going from C to B, I'm not usually saying, of course, it's a half step going backwards. What I'm going to say is it's going to be going from C to B is always going C up to B, which means it's going to be an 11 note away going forward, right? If I went from this C up, or this C up, it would be 11 frets up this way. So that's one thing to kind of consider on the intervals. We don't really say we're going backwards on the intervals. The intervals are kind of defined as going basically one way. So if I'm going from C back to B from the perspective of the C major scale, we're going to say that's going to be an 11 note away major 7. But if I looked at it from the perspective of the B, then we're going from the B to the C. So we could say from the perspective of the major scale, that would be going from the 7th back to the 1st, right? So now we're going from the 7th back to the 1st. And whenever we're going from B to C, we're always measuring it that way. And so it would be a 1 note away, which would be a minor 2nd, right? And then we can think about it from the perspective possibly of the Locrian, right? So if I did that same thing down here on the Locrian, and we're going from now the Locrian B, the Locrian is now the 1st, B to C. So from the perspective of the Locrian, the relative positions, it would be going from the 1 to the 2, which would be a 1 note away major 2nd, right? And then from the perspective of the Locrian, if I went the other way, we would be going from the second back to the first. So, which would be, so that from the perspective of the Locrian, it would be a 11 note away major 7. So I'm getting kind of mixed up in my, but there's multiple different ways I can see just going from the 2 notes from the perspective of the different modes. That's the idea. I'm going to try to work into my practice routine a little bit more to try to situate myself on the guitar and be able to be as more dexterous. And it's kind of boggling my mind right now, so I might have messed things up right there. But in any case, I think that's something worth doing, so I might build another exercise based on that. But I'm going to keep that in mind as we go through these. All right, so we're on the Locrian mode. We're going to be building around this interval, around this note. We have the Locrian mode has a 0 note away perfect first, a 1 note away minor second. That's the weird one with regards to both the main major and the main minor. Both of them having a 2 note away second, major second. This one, the 1 note away minor second, is actually equivalent to the Phrygian. And then we have the 3 note away minor third, which is the same you would expect on a minor scale, which the Locrian is closer to than the major. 5 note away perfect fourth, which is what you would expect on both major and minor. And then it has a 6 note away, and it's a diminished fifth. So that's the weird one. It's not anywhere else. And then we have the 8 note away minor 6, which on the major would be a 9 note away major 6. This is what we would expect on a minor mode, which in essence the Locrian is with an added flat 5. And then we have a 10 note away minor 7, which is what we would expect on a minor mode, the major being an 11 note away major 7.